Three children went to bed in their home in Duxbury, Massachusetts, on January 24, 2023. They would never wake up. 5-year-old Cora Clancy, 3-year-old Dawson Clancy, and 8-month-old Callan Clancy. 3 siblings, 3 young lives, and 1 devastating tragedy. It was a tragedy that would take 3 children from their father. A tragedy that would turn a family home into the center of a criminal investigation. A tragedy that would lead to a courtroom battle over mental illness, responsibility, and what happened inside one mother's mind. Cora was 5 years old. Dawson was 3. Callan was only 8 months old. Their lives had barely begun when tragedy entered their home. They should have had years ahead of them. Cora should have grown older. Dawson should have experienced his first years of school. Callan should have learned to walk, talk, and discover the world around him. Instead, those possibilities ended in tragedy. And what makes this tragedy even harder to comprehend is where it happened. It happened inside the family's own home, a place where these children should have been protected. Instead, that home became the setting for a tragedy that would destroy the family. By the end of that evening, Cora was dead. Dawson was dead. Callan was fighting for his life. Emergency responders arrived and found the children critically injured. Cora and Dawson could not be saved. Callan was transported to Boston Children's Hospital, where doctors continued fighting to keep him alive. Several days later, another tragedy came. Callan died from complications of the injuries he had suffered. He was 8 months old. With his death, the tragedy became complete. 3 children were gone. 3 siblings who had shared the same home, the same parents, and the same family life were now victims of a tragedy that could never be undone. Their father, Patrick Clancy, had lost all 3 of his children. But the tragedy did not end there. Lindsay Clancy, the children's mother, was also found critically injured outside the home after an apparent suicide attempt. She survived, but suffered catastrophic injuries that left her paralyzed. So the tragedy continued. A father was left to mourn 3 children. A mother survived and would eventually face criminal charges. And the tragedy moved from a family home into a courtroom. The physical events are largely undisputed. The children were strangled using exercise resistance bands. The defense does not dispute that Lindsay caused their deaths. The central question is why she did it, and whether her mental condition made her legally responsible. That question would become the foundation of the case. Before the courtroom arguments, however, there was the night itself. Patrick left the family home to pick up food. Lindsay remained behind with Cora, Dawson, and Callan. According to prosecutors, Lindsay knew Patrick would be away for a period of time. Prosecutors say she then took the children into the basement, where she strangled them. 3 children became victims of the same tragedy. When Patrick returned, he did not return to the family he had left. He returned to a tragedy that would permanently change his life. Police and emergency responders entered the home. Cora and Dawson were transported to a hospital, but were pronounced dead. Callan was flown to Boston Children's Hospital. For several days, there was still hope that the youngest child might survive. That hope became another part of the tragedy when Callan died. There would be no first day of school for Cora, no chance to watch Dawson grow older, no opportunity for Callan to take his first steps, say his first words, or grow up beside his siblings. Their futures disappeared in a tragedy that no one in the family could undo. And that is why this case is more than a question of what happened in a house on one night. It is a tragedy involving 3 children, a devastated father, a mother accused of killing them, and a legal system forced to examine the relationship between severe mental illness and criminal responsibility. The tragedy also had a history. In the months before January 24th, Lindsay's mental health had deteriorated. Following Callan's birth, she experienced serious mental health difficulties. She struggled with depression, anxiety, and severe insomnia. She reported suicidal thoughts and received psychiatric treatment. In early January 2023, she voluntarily entered McLean Hospital for 5 days. She was discharged on January 5th. 19 days later, tragedy struck. That timeline became critically important. The defense argues that Lindsay was suffering from severe postpartum psychiatric illness, including postpartum psychosis, and that her condition had reached a point where she could not understand the criminality of her actions. The prosecution presents a different explanation. Prosecutors argue that Lindsay's actions showed planning and awareness, including arranging for Patrick to leave the home and then carrying out the killings. So the tragedy created two competing explanations. One side sees a mother overwhelmed by severe psychiatric illness. The other sees a woman who deliberately killed her children and then attempted suicide. The jury must decide which interpretation is supported by the evidence. But before that legal battle, it is important to understand the children at the center of the tragedy. The children, Cora, was the oldest of the three. At 5, she was still very young, but she was old enough to have developed routines, relationships, and memories with her family. Dawson was 3, still in the earliest years of childhood. Callan was the youngest, an 8-month-old baby whose life had barely begun. Their ages matter because they show just how much of their futures was lost. This was not a case involving people who had already lived long lives. It was a tragedy involving children who were only beginning to discover the world. Their father later became one of the most important figures in the case. Patrick had to live with the loss of all 3 children. He also had to sit through a trial involving the woman who was their mother. Yet Patrick's position has been unusually complicated. He has expressed love for his children and support for the argument that Lindsay was severely mentally ill. His position does not change the deaths, and it does not lessen the tragedy. But it demonstrates how difficult this case is to reduce to simple categories of victim and accused. There was grief, there was loss, there was a criminal investigation, and there was tragedy on a scale that the family could never reverse. The question then became, what happened to Lindsay before the killings? Mental health decline. After Callan's birth, Lindsay's condition reportedly worsened. She experienced symptoms that included depression, anxiety, insomnia, and suicidal thoughts. Her treatment became increasingly complex. She saw mental health professionals and was prescribed multiple psychiatric medications. The defense has argued that the number and combination of medications contributed to her deterioration and that providers failed to recognize or adequately treat postpartum illness. But the medical record also contains evidence that complicates that argument. During her January hospitalization at McLean, psychiatrist Dr. Aaliyah Goodhart testified that Lindsay was diagnosed with severe major depressive disorder without psychotic features. Goodhart said Lindsay did not show clear signs of psychosis during that stay and appeared to improve before discharge. That testimony matters because it places Lindsay's condition under medical observation less than 3 weeks before the tragedy. If she was seriously ill, how severe was that illness? And did it become something fundamentally different by January 24th? The defense says it did. The prosecution says, the evidence does not establish that Lindsay was in psychosis when she killed the children. Those competing interpretations would become the heart of the legal battle. There is another important distinction. Mental illness does not automatically mean legal insanity. A person can suffer from depression or another psychiatric disorder and still be legally responsible for criminal conduct. The defense therefore has to prove more than the existence of illness. It must persuade the jury that Lindsay's mental condition was severe enough to meet the legal standard for lack of criminal responsibility. That is why the evidence from the days before the killings matters so much. On January 23rd, 1 day before the deaths, Lindsay participated in a virtual psychiatric appointment. Recent trial testimony has described her as depressed, but there was no indication in that appointment that she expressed an intention to kill herself or anyone else. The next day, the tragedy happened. The mental health evidence is especially important because it forces the court to look beyond the final hours and examine the period when Lindsay was asking for help. According to testimony presented at trial, her difficulties did not begin on the day of the killings. They developed over time. After Callan's birth, She described feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope. Sleep became a major problem. Her thoughts became darker. She reported suicidal thinking, and people around her noticed changes in the way she was functioning. For the defense, those details are not excuses. They are evidence of a deteriorating psychiatric condition. The defense has argued that Lindsay's treatment history should be viewed as a warning sign. She saw multiple providers, received different diagnoses or formulations, and was prescribed a complicated group of medications. Her attorneys argue that the medical system treated symptoms without recognizing the larger disorder that was developing. The prosecution does not accept that the treatment history proves Lindsay was psychotic. That distinction is crucial. A person can be desperate, depressed, exhausted, or suicidal without being legally insane. The court therefore has to separate several ideas that can sound similar but are not the same. Depression is not psychosis. Suicidal thoughts are not the same as homicidal intent. Medication problems are not automatically proof of insanity. And evidence of mental illness is not automatically proof of a lack of criminal responsibility. The jury must consider the entire picture. That picture includes what Lindsay said to doctors, what doctors observed, what family members noticed, what investigators found, and what Lindsay did on January 24th. It also includes the period immediately after the killings. When Lindsay was found outside the house, she had suffered life-changing injuries. She was eventually left paralyzed, meaning that the consequences of that night would continue for the rest of her life, regardless of the criminal verdict. The prosecution and defense interpret the aftermath differently as well. For prosecutors, the suicide attempt followed the killings and is part of the sequence they say demonstrates that Lindsay knew what she had done. For the defense, the attempt is consistent with the psychiatric crisis they say had already taken control of her thinking. Again, the same facts can be viewed through two completely different explanations. That is why this trial has attracted so much attention. It is not simply asking whether a crime occurred. It is asking how a person who had been described by friends and family as a loving and involved mother could become responsible for the deaths of her 3 children. That question is emotionally difficult, but the jury cannot decide the case only through emotion. They must consider evidence. They must consider testimony. They must consider the law, and they must determine whether the prosecution has proved criminal responsibility beyond the applicable legal standard while considering the defense's insanity claim. The prosecution has already acknowledged that Lindsay had mental health problems. Its argument is not that she was perfectly healthy. Its argument is that illness does not remove responsibility when the evidence shows a person understood what she was doing. The defense is asking the jury to look at the same evidence and reach the opposite conclusion. That disagreement is the legal battle. It is also why the case cannot responsibly be reduced to a single sentence. Calling it only a murder case ignores the psychiatric evidence. Calling it only a mental health tragedy ignores the deliberate acts alleged by prosecutors. The truth has to be tested in court. And because the trial is still underway, any conclusion beyond the established facts would be premature. The most responsible way to tell this story is therefore to keep the focus where it belongs, on the evidence, on the children, and on the question the jury must answer. 3 young lives ended. A family was permanently changed. And a courtroom is now being asked to determine how the law should understand the mind of the person who caused those deaths. Whatever the verdict, the case will leave difficult questions about psychiatric care, postpartum illness, warning signs, and the responsibility of medical professionals when a vulnerable parent asks for help during a psychiatric crisis. The day of the killings, January 24, began as another day in the family's life. But by evening, everything had changed. Patrick left the home to pick up food and make a pharmacy stop. Lindsay remained with the children. Prosecutors say she knew roughly how long Patrick would be gone. They point to evidence about travel times and argue that she deliberately created a period in which she would be alone with the children. The defense disputes the meaning of those actions. The physical evidence, however, established the devastating result. The children were found in the basement, with exercise bands around their necks. Cora and Dawson were dead. Callan was critically injured. Lindsay was found outside after apparently attempting suicide by cutting her wrists and jumping from a second-story window. The fall caused severe injuries and left her paralyzed. The emergency response that followed became the beginning of the criminal investigation. Investigators collected physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, examined medical records, and reconstructed the family's final hours. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner determined that Cora and Dawson died from asphyxia and that Callan died from complications of asphyxia. The investigation eventually produced 3 murder charges and 3 strangulation charges. Lindsay pleaded not guilty. But the case would not turn only on physical evidence. The most important evidence would concern her mind. What did she believe she was doing? Did she understand that the children would die? Was she acting under a psychotic belief? Or was she making deliberate choices while suffering from depression and other mental health problems? Those questions became the legal battle. The prosecution's theory is straightforward in its central claim. Prosecutors argue that Lindsay intentionally killed her children. They point to the circumstances of Patrick leaving the house, the evidence concerning timing, the method used to kill the children, and Lindsay's subsequent attempt to take her own life. In the prosecution's view, these actions demonstrate planning and awareness. The defense accepts that Lindsay caused the deaths, but argues that she was not criminally responsible because of severe mental illness. Defense attorneys have emphasized her psychiatric history, her worsening symptoms, her insomnia, suicidal thinking, treatment history, and the medications she was prescribed. They argue that she suffered from postpartum psychosis and that her perception of reality had become severely distorted. The trial began in 2026, after years of investigation and pre-trial litigation. Jury selection began in July, and opening statements followed later that month. The trial has since focused heavily on Lindsay's psychiatric care before the killings. Psychiatrists have testified about her symptoms and treatment. Friends and family members have described her as a devoted mother who had been struggling. Prosecutors have presented evidence intended to show that she remained capable of planning and making decisions. The defense has presented evidence intended to show that her deterioration was more severe than the medical system recognized. Even Lindsay's hospital stay has become a point of dispute. Her treating psychiatrist testified that she showed no psychosis there and improved during the 5 days she was hospitalized. The defense argues that this does not prove she was not psychotic 19 days later. That disagreement illustrates the difficulty of the case. Psychiatric illness can change, symptoms can fluctuate, and the jury is being asked to determine a person's mental state at one specific point in time, the moment she killed her children. The legal consequences are enormous. If Lindsay is convicted of murder, she faces the most severe criminal punishment available under Massachusetts law, including life imprisonment without parole. If she is found not guilty by reason of insanity, that does not simply mean she walks free. Massachusetts law allows a person found not criminally responsible because of mental illness to be committed to a secure psychiatric facility, subject to legal procedures governing continued confinement and possible release. So the legal battle is not simply about prison or freedom. It is about responsibility. It is about whether the evidence proves that Lindsay understood the criminal nature of her conduct or was able to conform her actions to the law. And as of August 10, 2026, the jury has not delivered a verdict. The trial is still underway. That means the final chapter cannot honestly be written yet. What can be said with certainty is that Cora, Dawson, and Callan are dead. Their father has lost 3 children. Their mother survived the attempt to take her own life and now faces the criminal justice system. The tragedy has moved from the basement of a family home to a courtroom where doctors, investigators, family members, and experts are being asked to explain how it happened. But no explanation can restore the 3 lives that were lost. Cora will never grow older. Dawson will never grow up. Callan will never know the life that was waiting for him. Their deaths remain the central tragedy of this case, And whatever the jury ultimately decides about Lindsay's mental state, that tragedy will remain unchanged. The legal battle may determine responsibility. It may determine Lindsay's future. It may influence how people understand postpartum mental illness and the failures that can occur when severe symptoms are missed. But it cannot change the past. 3 children entered that night alive. 3 children did not leave it alive. That is the fact at the center of everything. And as the trial continues, the question before the jury remains painfully simple. Even if the answer is not, was Lindsay Clancy a woman who deliberately chose to kill her children, or was she a severely mentally ill mother whose illness had destroyed her ability to understand what she was doing? The evidence will determine the verdict. The court will determine the legal consequences. But for Patrick Clancy and everyone who knew Cora, Dawson, and Callan, the deepest consequence is already permanent. They are gone, and no verdict can change that. If you found this investigation informative, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more carefully researched true crime documentaries. And remember the names at the center of this story: Cora, Dawson, and Callan. Thank you for watching.